here. There are more people coming. We are now on our third or fourth.
Wow, we've got 42 people.
Yeah, so again.
At least we don't have to switch rooms if there are too many people here this time.
That's true, that's true. We have the ever expanding room here. All right, so let us get started. My name is David Levithan. I am a publisher and editorial director at Scholastic, as well as an author. And I'm so excited to be here for our next installment of the Read with Pride Book Festival. I'm so excited to be partnering with Writer's Block Bookstore in Winter Park, Florida, to do this event. You will hear me say often in the next hour, we love independent bookstores. We urge you to support independent bookstores. Writer's Block has all of these authors' books available. I'm sure they will be putting up the link to them during the talk in the chat, or just go to their website and order all of these authors' books. Again, we really, especially at this time, want to support all of our independent bookstores. And tonight, we really want to support Writer's Block. So thank you, Writer's Block, for setting this up. And we will get started now. So I am so excited to be on this panel. It makes it so easy doing these Read with Pride because these are all authors I genuinely love. I love them as authors, illustrator, and also as people. And I'm really excited for this conversation. Some of my favorite books, period, not just queer books in Kidlit and YA are represented tonight. So with me, I'm just going to go in the order that I'm seeing them. Kacen Callender is with us, is going to be talking about King and the Dragonflies, their masterful middle grade book. I will say, just because I have to, Kacen also wrote one of my favorite YA books this year, Felix Ever After. So again, to write basically my favorite middle grade and favorite YA in the same year, I mean, you're just putting us all to shame, Kacen, but that's okay. We love you anyway. The books are fantastic and I can't wait to talk about them. We have Molly Knox Osertag, the author of the Witch Boy series. The most recent book is The Midwinter Witch. These are just amazing graphic novels that just take us into this fabulous, fantastic world and also talk about gender and so many other things in a clever, thoughtful, and just always just refreshing, humorous, adventurous way. It's incredible. And they have hit or struck such a chord with readers, and it's amazing to see. I've been at conventions and just seeing people literally light up when they've been online waiting to talk to Molly and say how much the books mean to them. Then we have Will Walton, who his book, I Felt a Funeral in My Brain, just came out in paperback, and it is a masterpiece. Don't just take my word for it. Both A.S. King and Andrew Smith, two YA authors I revere, also said it was among the best books they'd read, not just of the year, but of the decade. It is just an incredible amalgam of prose and poetry, talking about grief and identity, growing up down south, and just grappling with your just everything at once when you're an adolescent, and how you don't get to just deal with one thing in a row when you're dealing with your identity. Sometimes it comes at you all at once. Then we have Aida Salazar, whose book, The Moon Within, is just so gorgeous. One of those books that moves you to tears, but also gives you such immense hope and gratitude for life. It's just an extraordinary book. And she has a new book coming out soon, which I hope she will tell us a little bit about and tease to in this. And then we have Alex Gino, the notorious most challenged author in America. Woo! No, I mean, Alex's book, George, came to me and was the biggest gift I could have ever gotten as an editor and publisher. It is a spectacular book that genuinely is helping to change the world, and that what more can you ask for? George made pretty much every best of the year list, has become a modern classic. And then most recently, in Alex's new book, Rick, they returned to the world of Melissa, the protagonist of the first book, but focused instead on another character, Rick, who, again, might not have been the character, if you read George, you thought would be the main character of the next book. It is such a wonderful book. And again, I can't wait to talk about it with Alex. So that is just a brief overview of why I love these people and why I love their books so much.
Is he frozen for everyone else?
I think we just lost David.
Oh, that's so tragic. David, please return to us.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like he was eventually going to say that we should each talk about our books.
That's true.
I hate to
That's
go
a good
on without
idea.
him,
That was in the plan.
Yeah.
When
So maybe
fearless
we'll come back,
leader.
by the time. Well, I can go first since David spoke about me first. So my first book was King and the Dragonflies, and that's what David mentioned. There's this middle grade right here, which is about 12-year-old Kingston James, whose brother Khalid has unfortunately passed away. And King thinks that his brother has turned into a dragonfly. So King spends his days going down to the bayou to search for what he thinks is his brother's new form. And he's struggling with grief with his family, with his parents, but he's also struggling with the loss of his best friend, Sandy Sanders, because right before Khalid passed away, Khalid told King to end his friendship with Sandy because Khalid overheard Sandy telling King that he's gay. And Khalid said, "You don't want anyone else to think that you're gay too, do you?" So the book then kind of takes a turn when King finds Sandy Sanders hiding in his backyard, and they have both run away to escape Sandy's abusive father. And it really was inspired by me wanting to create more representation for Black and queer youth, especially boys. I was having dinner with my editor, Andrea Davis Pinkney, one night, and she mentioned that she'd never seen a middle grade featuring a Black boy who was gay as a protagonist, and I realized that I hadn't either. So that was really the initial spark, and then it kind of grew from there.
So thank you, Kacen. I'm back. The last words I heard before I disappeared were Alex going, "I think David's gone," which is just a weird feeling. We'll see if it happens again. All right, Molly, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I just want to say I just read King and the Dragonflies today because I wanted to catch up on everyone's books, and it was so beautiful. It really moved me.
Thank you.
I'm Molly. I have done the Witch Boy series. The first book is just called The Witch Boy. I didn't come up with a separate name for the series. And it is about, in some ways, it is this very fun escapist world where there's this big family that lives in the woods and they all practice magic. But on the other hand, they have really strict gender roles. All of the women are witches and all of the men are shapeshifters. And there's kind of like no in-betweens and no exceptions. And so the books follow Aster, who is a young boy who just can't get the hang of shapeshifting, but he knows that he's a witch and he knows that he wants to be a witch. And so the trilogy kind of follows Aster pursuing this thing that he loves and sort of like explores themes of like getting accepted by your community and also not getting accepted and having to like learn to love yourself anyway. And it follows his friendship with two girls, Charlie and Aster, who both are kind of like different from people around them too. And yeah, they're just kind of very magical fantasy books that I still really wanted to have sort of a resonant message about gender and not fitting into gender roles and how important it is to find other people who really get you and support you. So yeah, The Midwinter Witch is the last one. It just came out last year, and it's really nice having the series out. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Molly. All right, Will, tell us a little bit. I felt a funeral in my brain.
Before I do, I just want to say that I was a bookseller up until March, and selling Molly's book to a bunch of middle grade clientele was like, it was like not an infrequent occurrence at all, and it was one of the biggest delights. And also, I'm such a fan of Kate's body of work as a whole. So anyway, I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you.
But yeah, I felt the funeral in my brain is The second book that I wrote, it came out a couple years ago in hardcover, and as David mentioned just now, a week or two ago in paperback. And it's the story of Avery Fowle, who is a 17-year-old queer boy living in Georgia with his mom. However, his primary caregiver are his grandparents who live across the street from him. And sort of while his mom is dealing with some addiction issues that have sort of risen to the top of their life for one summer, she goes to get help for that, and he is sort of left not exactly to his own devices, but he's living with his grandparents, kind of living between his own empty house, or the house that he shares with his mom, and the house that he shares with his grandparents, and in kind of that liminal space, also thinking about poems and sort of wanting to be a poet and wondering like how his story, which seems so complicated to him, if you write it in poetry, does it work that way? Can he actually see all of the pieces? And so he actually tries to do that and begins to see the pieces of his life sort of fall into place in a way that he can kind of manage. So that's the story.
Awesome, thanks, Will. All right, Aida?
Well, my book is The Moon Within. It's a novel in verse, and it follows Celie Rivera. She's an 11-year-old girl who is on the cusp of adolescence, and she and her best friend are kind of like the same boy, but for different reasons, because we discover that the best friend is questioning their gender and kind of blossoming in a different way. And so when they try to kind of befriend the boy is a bigot to her best friend. And so she has to kind of really decide where her loyalties lie. And it's a book really about how to be an ally to her gender fluid friend. And it's also about the power of menstruation and the kind of universal connection to ancestors also. In the book, the main character, their families, both of the main characters, their families are trying to kind of reclaim their indigenous ancestry from Mexico. And they kind of celebrate not only the coming of age through menstruation, but also the blossoming into an ometeot. An ometeot is the goddess spirit, the god spirit, kind of the creator, and they are neither male or female, but both. They're divine duality. And so the community really kind of welcomes them and into this kind of rite of passage as a xochiwa. A xochiwa is somebody who bears flowers on their chest. And a xochiwa is also in pre-Columbian times was somebody who's considered a priest and who presided over sacred ceremonies. So it's really about kind of expanding and reaching back into an ancestry and cultural heritage that had different ideas of gender, and kind of embracing the power of menstruation and gender fluidity. And that's the book.
Awesome. All right, Alex?
Hi. So my first book was Melissa's story called George, about a transgender girl named Melissa. And there were a lot of people who wanted a sequel, which is quite a compliment. But in order to have a sequel, I would have to have plot. Apparently, this is what David tells me. But in order to have plot, I have to have things go wrong, and I have to have problems. And I want the next couple of years of Melissa's life to be so smooth and so simple and basically too boring to write a book about. But I loved the idea that people wanted to, what it seemed like they wanted was to know that Melissa was well. And so I thought about, like, well, where would Melissa be in junior high school? And she would, in the world we're living in, well, until a couple of months ago, she would at school find the after school spectrum group. They call themselves the Rainbow Spectrum, and they're LGBTQ, IAP plus inclusive, and they have their language down. And so I stumbled upon who in the book do I want to put in that situation. And so in the book, there was a bully. In Melissa's story, there's a bully, and there was a bully's best friend, and that's Rick. And so Rick is coming into his own. Rick is realizing that he has alternatives, and that if his best friend is a jerk, it can be his ex-best friend. And he can find his space in a very large and broad queer spectrum.
All right. And there's so many other, I'm like, but mention that. No, always in time. I'm like, Grandpa, mention Grandpa. No.
We can't say everything about all the books, David.
You can't say everything about all the books.
There's so
all
much
of them have my favorite parts of everything. All right, well, I'm going to go back and ask some questions. I'm going to go in reverse order, so I'll start with you, Alex, in a second. I do remember in my rush to say how much I love these authors and start off, there were a few other items I wanted to say. One, just as far as how this is going to go, if you have questions for the authors, please put them in the chat or send them in to us. And when we get to the Q&A, I will be looking at the questions that have come in from the chat. I have a few that were already sent in, and that's how we're going to do the Q&A. So feel free to ask questions at any time in the chat bar. Please do not unmute yourself and ask questions. That's bad. Chat bar, good. So that's how it's going to work. Basically, I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to questions probably when we get to about 7:30 or so Eastern Standard Time. But also I wanted to say that this has been a rough month for hopefully all of us, insofar as there's just a lot that we've been engaged with. And when we were starting with Read with Pride, we really felt strongly that we had just stayed outright, that we believe that Pride is not just about queerness and not just about queer identity. Pride very much is about all of our identities. And until any queer person can feel pride about every part of their identity, then Pride is not complete. And so again, we just wanted to state that, I mean, in support of Black Lives Matter, in support of trans rights, in complete opposition to anybody who would take away any rights from anyone, we just wanted to make sure that, again, while this is a celebration of queer pride, that we want to ally or align ourselves with, again, all of the other struggles that are going on right now. So that said, again, just wanted to acknowledge that. Was going to acknowledge it at first, but rushed into my love for the authors. It happens sometimes. All right, so now the hard-hitting Barbara Walters-like questions. No, they're not really. Barbara Walters-like, and I understand that at YA events, I'm gonna totally have to take that reference out at some point, but I'm hanging on to it for as long as I can. All right, so Alex, I'm curious about how you got to know Rick. I mean, because again, this is somebody who really does not have very much page time in the first novel. And then you grant him your third novel. So what was it like to sort of build a character who was so secondary into a main character?
Great. First of all, happy Gay Wrath Month to you. I'm celebrating Gay Wrath Month. And I guess the thing about Rick is that he's a cisgender boy. And so in that way, it's kind of weird for me to be giving this airtime to this cisgender boy that was not my original intentions as a writer. But at the same time, the main character of my first book was bullied, and I know what that story is, by a bully. And I've learned about that cycle of violence. It doesn't interest me very much to write about. But the bully has this best friend. And how do the layers happen that you get in there? And as someone who took a lot of social cues from my best friend, and I was very lucky that my best friend was not a horrible person, I could totally imagine just going along with what someone else said until you were in too deep to do anything about it. and that kid can come back and that kid can find their home, absolutely intrigued me. And as I was writing George, I did very purposefully not ever have Rick instigate it. Because Rick and Melissa were friends way before the bully ever got there. And I wanted this kid to like get their own.
That makes total sense. All right, so then I'm gonna bounce to Aida and ask about this notion of sort of looking at queerness from the outsider's view, of it being a very, very, very important supporting character. I mean, practically a lead character, but not the viewpoint character. And what it is like to sort of know that you are trying to convey an experience, but do it from the point of view of the best friend.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was trying, of course, always trying to be really careful when I was writing this character, Marco, because, of course, I didn't want to harm any child, and I was very conscientious of making sure that I was telling the story that would rewrite the way that I'm Mexican, so a very homophobic and transphobic community has seen transgender and anybody on the gender spectrum and in the sexuality spectrum as well, you know. So I wanted to provide for my community a way to remember ancestral tradition that wasn't that way. And so I tried to just write it from how the girl would receive it and how a community who was really trying to reclaim that and to bring healing, because I think that all of the wisdom, pre-Columbian wisdom, was decimated during colonization. So it's an act of kind of healing from colonization to try and reclaim and to empower a child in this way. And, you know, I happen to come, you know, be in the Bay Area, and I'm blessed to have, you know, several gender fluid and trans children in my life. And I've seen how my community is doing this, and I wanted to depict that in the book. But I was also really careful to make sure that I didn't tell a story that wasn't mine fully. You know, the New York Times actually critiqued my book because it was, I'm hearing an echo. Ooh, do you guys hear that?
Mm-mm.
No, okay, good. The New York Times critiqued my book because they said I didn't go far enough, because I didn't talk about the gender fluid character's menstruation. And what they completely missed was that was not my story to tell. And I did it because it wasn't I didn't tell that story because it wasn't. So, you know, I'm working on an anthology that's going to be coming out in a couple years on stories on menstruation, and we're going to have, you know, for the first time, an author write about menstruation, a two-spirit author write about menstruation, though they no longer menstruate. And so, you know, so that was all that's all part of kind of what motivated that bringing up allyship in my book.
All right, Will, I'm going to ask you about form. And I told you we were prepping that one of my favorite quotes recently was from a poet, Ray Belcourt, in the introduction to his first book of poems. He talks about the inherent queerness of poetry and how that there is something about form and just the playing with form that a poet does that is sort of, again, a queerness of prose, I guess you could say. Those are my words, not his. So I'm curious about how much you did think about how form and theme matched up when you were building the sort of interesting amalgam of both poetry and prose that is I Felt a Funeral.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely thought about it a lot, because I was like struggling so hard to kind of like form a really cohesive narrative in telling the story. So it kind of involved, I needed to sort of have this permission to like smash it up, and in reading books that are novels, or maybe they're novels in verse, but that also do this, I got all of this validation, and then upon like researching those novels, found that like a lot of the motivation behind that was like, it was actually like kind of smashing patriarchy by way of smashing up narrative, as something that sort of exists as sort of like a residual, you know, as this construct that was like built by these systems that are patriarchal and you know, heterosexist and racist and all of this stuff. And so, and that actually kind of like fueled a kind of like political fire within me when it came to like writing, and how I would go about that. So that was definitely part of it. There's this amazing quote that I found. I knew you were going to ask me about this. And I have this in my Instagram, like bio, but it's a review of Sana Wani reviewed this book called Wash's Prayers by Noor Naga, which is it's a book of poems in verse. And it has this amazing quote, narrative is cluttered with frequencies of oppression and responses to oppression, and that its language compels us to answer in the same. Narrative requires world building that cannot be outside the world's entrenchment in racism, colonialism, imperialism, etc., whereas poetry, the diacritical, a ground from which a grammar might spring. And I was just so, I mean, that was like, that puts it in so much more like of a clear way than I ever thought about it. But that kind of potential there is something that was really exciting for me. And my book is a novel like split up into prose at times, but this idea that is something to be pursued and that there are new ways to tell stories that sort of exist outside of this world of oppression was really, really, really beautiful to me.
Awesome. All right, so Molly, I wanted to ask you, I mean, one of the things that shouldn't have surprised me, but surprised me with my own book every day was that I found writing a story in which a person changes bodies every day was this great Trojan horse to have conversations about gender and conversations about identity with whole schools and lots of people who would never have read a book if I had just written realistic fiction. And so, again, what I love about the reaction to your novels is that they're so engaged in all of these themes, and they're so wonderfully both drawn and in the words. So I'd love to hear about your experience of sort of using sort of fantastical or speculative conceits in order to talk about real issues and connecting with readers that way.
Yeah, definitely. That was very much like the heart of the idea of those books. I always really loved fantasy and stories that sort of have this extra supernatural element to them, because I feel like it makes it feel a little bit more universal, which I just find really appealing. But I started writing The Witch Boy when I was like pretty young, in like my early 20s. It was before I had come out even to myself, but I sort of had a lot of friends around that time who were like starting to like really like come into their own identities and come out. And I think it was like partially I was like trying to like explore and understand these ideas of gender and gender roles in a way that made sense for me. And to do that, I kind of wanted to take it outside of the real world and say, instead of kind of like the classic gender roles of our world, it's these really strict magical rules, and to sort of take it away from anything kind of like that is like directly referencing the real world and just make it its own thing, but one where you still really relate to this character who is like not like a typical boy in lots of ways, and who is trying to sort of like figure out what his identity is. I definitely wanted to make a book, was like very aware that I was making a book for young children, that it's a middle grade book and it's a graphic novel, so a lot of time even younger kids pick it up. And I really wanted to, I think like Trojan horse is honestly a great term for it. I wanted to sort of deliver this idea that just because people want you to be a certain way or want you to follow certain gender roles, that you do not have to, and that it's really important to listen to sort of what your heart is telling you about who you are. And so I wanted to deliver that idea, but I wanted to divorce it a little bit from words that might be kind of scary for kids who are not quite ready to like have like dialogue about queer spaces and like put words on their identity yet. I also love books that do that very precisely, like George, and like books that are just very like, here is exactly like what the trans experience is or the gay experience. And I think those are such amazing like paths too. But yeah, for this one, I just wanted it to be like something that kids could come into sort of wanting to read a fun magical adventure, and then kind of come out with a feeling like it is okay to question your gender or question sort of what you are expected to be. So yeah, that's sort of where all the magic in it came from.
I love the notion of the books we create being queer spaces in themselves.
Yeah.
I think that is so true to my own experience and the experience I've heard from readers, and I think is true for all of the novels we're speaking about.
Yeah.
So, Kacen, I'm going to ask you, I mean, just going off of sort of your introduction and what you were saying, I mean, having that conversation, I remember having that conversation with Andrea too, where she was like, oh, this is what Kacen's writing. Can you think of any other books about Black gay boys for middle grade? And I was stumped too. So I'm curious about how that affects sort of your writing process, knowing that you are creating this queer space of the novel for readers who really have not gotten this queer space before, and how that affects the creative process, if at all.
I think that it definitely creates a sense of responsibility, knowing that this is potentially, even if it's not the first book, it's potentially the first book a young reader is going to pick up and see themselves represented in, or see a window to another life, and that could potentially change their lives in a meaningful way also. So I feel that responsibility, but it doesn't really affect my creativity in a sense that it's like burdensome, or it kind of makes me stop in my process. I think it kind of gives me that fire and motivation to really look at the story in a tender and careful way, and just to be very careful with my words and to be careful with the discussion I want to spark with the book. So like when I went in writing it, I knew that one of the big conversations that I would want to have with young readers was just kind of like asking the question, well, what is it like to have intersectional identities? Like if you're a white boy who is gay, is it the same as being a Black person? Why or why not? Like why are those identities so different in so many different ways? And I think that those are conversations that young people are eager to have. I've had conversations with some at some school visits, and they're all always like super ready to jump in and talk about those intersecting identities. And I also think a lot about how I needed these books when I was younger. So for example, when I was younger, I was told that Black people can't be gay. So those are just the sort of things that I keep in mind as I'm writing for younger people. It's not really like a burden, but it's just kind of like a constant motivation to make sure I'm writing, first of all, because I feel like there's an importance in continuing to write, but also just making sure the story reaches the young reader in the way that I want it to.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to ask a question to you all, although first I'm going to remind the audience, please, if you have questions, feel free to send them into the chat area where I can take a look at them and ask them of the authors. But I'm going to still keep the questions to myself for a little bit longer, not much longer, because I do want to talk about sort of how much of yourself you put into the books, and sort of, is there a line that you draw while you're writing? Is there some distance that you try to give yourself from the books, or does it sort of feel while you're writing that you're all in and you don't really know which pieces of you are going to come out until you're actually writing and they're there on the page?
I feel like for me with the Witch Boy books, I didn't quite realize how much of myself I was putting into them until I stepped back a little bit, until I was done with the first one and could look at it and see like, oh, even though there's not like a one-to-one to my experience, there's all these themes that ended up being very personal. And so it can definitely sneak in. And I can't say what it is yet, but I'm working on a new book that like has sort of is more centrally, like has like queerness like more centrally in it, and like has a character who is a lesbian, and that obviously like hits home closer for me. And it's like, it's so vulnerable. I really didn't expect how scary it would be to be taking such like real feelings and sort of consciously putting them on the page. And so I'm always so, it like has like really increased my respect for everyone who writes these stories that are so intensely personal, because it just is, it's vulnerable and it's visible in a way that is like really, really interesting.
I would.
I
Oh,
guess,
go ahead.
oh, no, go ahead, Aida.
No. Okay. All right. Well, you know, I also similarly to Molly, I didn't kind of think about that. That I mean, I knew that I was writing a story based in Oakland that was based on my family, but when I wrote Marco, I didn't realize until later how much of myself was in Marco, because when I was you know, when I was a little girl, um, I was considered a tomboy. I cut my hair short. I dressed just like my brother. I wanted to be a brother to my brother, and I wanted to, you know, kind of exist in that way. And I came from a family of like 7 children, and all of them were girls except for that one brother. And and in my home, you know, my mother had many gay friends, and it was often a thing where we would see you know, drag shows. And it was kind of like, when I look back, I think about how full of grace those moments were, like some of the most magical moments in my childhood. And the reason was because it was freedom. And the reason why my mother kind of let me express my gender in whatever way I wanted to was because of that. It was informed by that. And my mother was very traditionally Mexican in many other ways. But when I got to be like in the 5th or 6th grade, you know, my cousins and Catholicism and my friends at school kind of like arrested that freedom and then, you know, what you have now is a very cisgendered, still, you know, and I'm queer, you know, I'm bisexual. So that also was hidden because of society. And so Marco, I realized, was what I felt like when I was a child, trying to kind of figure out where my gender expression lied.
Yeah, I also think that every character I write is in some part me, because it's coming from my brain and it's somehow coming from a way my neurons work. But at the same time, none of my characters might have my heart, my soul, my this, my that, but they don't have my experiences. They have a whole range of experiences that I did not and could not have had at the time. So in a lot of ways, my characters are, I'm imagining how things could have gone, more than I'm thinking through how things went.
I have kind of like similar, I grew up in a really like conservative evangelical Christian community. And so my like queer experience as a teen was actually like very suppressed, and I didn't actually get to inhabit it. So a lot of times when I'm writing these books, I am kind of imagining sort of like what my experience would be had I been able to inhabit it at the time. That's in one kind of way to answer the question. And specifically too, I felt a funeral in my brain. I was working on a book, and I grew up with 6 grandparents, and in the span between my first book coming out and my second book coming out, I lost 5 of them. And so I kept having this like renewed experience of grief and like really profound loss, because I felt like throughout most of my life, the only people who saw me as queer, as like a full person, were my grandparents. And so there was a lot of kind of grief that I needed to work through. And so that element of the book feels really like actually like extremely personal. Some of it is even pulled from like writing that I did sort of extraneous to any kind of novel that I was working on, and then put in.
Yeah, I think that I also, for a couple of my books like Hurricane Child and Felix Ever After, I think I wrote kind of like the character or the life I wish I'd been able to have when I was younger. So Felix Ever After, I really wish that I'd figured out that I was trans when I was a teenager, and like not had 10 plus years of life kind of like questioning and not really knowing who I truly was. So I feel like that was kind of like wish fulfillment in a way. And similarly with Hurricane Child, I was super like bullied and isolated in the same way that Caroline was, and she always just kind of like responded with this super amazing like determination and realization of this is who I am and no one can tell me otherwise. I kind of had wished I had that sort of like power and attitude when I was younger. So I did write from kind of like a wish fulfillment perspective. But for all of my writing and all of my books, I think that I'm a bit of a Virgo, so I tend to kind of like think of things in terms of like craft and like plot. And I think that the way that I can talk about putting myself into each of the books were that each character always had like a lesson or a theme that I had to learn in my own life when I was younger. And I could give like every example for every book, but I'm not going to do that. But I feel like that's how every character kind of takes a piece of myself. They have a lesson that they need to learn throughout their story arc, and that was something that I had to learn as well.
I think it's so interesting that we all like are kind of writing these wish fulfillments of our childhoods where we knew ourselves a little bit earlier and a little bit better, because there's like this really lovely synchronicity because the books that we are making are like making it more possible for kids to have those childhoods, and it feels like this, I don't know, like paying forward a wish from the past and like trying to pay it forward to the future.
Yeah, I find it interesting because I have to say, as the old man on the panel, I mean, and what I love about YA is like you've been doing it for like almost 20 years. My goodness, that's a lifetime. But it's interesting because I think it starts, you're totally rewriting yourself, and you are sort of seeing that, putting yourself in a position that you couldn't have been in because of where you were. And for me, over time, you start to be writing about your readers, because you start to understand them more, you start to see where they're at, and you start to be more of an observer than a participant, because you recognize it's different, but also they're just so fascinating to you, and you feel such empathy towards them that they start to weave themselves in just as much. Again, I agree with Alex. I think there's always a piece of you that's in there, but for me, it was interesting. I couldn't pinpoint where it migrated. But now when I'm writing a book, it doesn't feel like it is me anymore rewriting me. It really does feel like I've stepped into the other side of the page. It's fascinating. All right, I have a couple of questions that were sent in ahead of time. Again, I encourage everybody to send questions in the chat. I will warn you, I am totally prioritizing questions I can ask all of the panelists. So that's just a hint. Ask questions that all the panelists can answer. So one question, and again, this it's a two-part question. The first part honestly made me feel like I was on a panel in 2003 again when my first book came out. So I'm curious to see how you respond to it too. But the two-part question is, did you ever consider writing under a pseudonym to protect your identity? And then how do you respond to those who criticize your LGBTQIA+ characters?
Nope.
Nope.
Yeah, I mean, that's,
Yeah.
no for me.
No, yeah.
It makes me wonder if I should. There was a moment of, should I be protecting myself? Yeah, no, I haven't considered that either. As far as response for people who have been like anti-queer or transphobic, I'm curious to hear what other people say. Right now I'm in a place of like, I just don't have, like, that's not where my priority is. My priority is right now. My priority is in making sure I'm affirming and validating young readers. So if someone were to say anything to me, I ignore it. If someone says something to a young reader in front of me, I don't have the best reaction potentially, but I'm not very kind to them, obviously, but I try to like make sure that the young reader feels or knows that they are affirmed and validated.
Yeah, it's definitely, yeah, my readers are the priority, and it's just not for anyone else. Surprisingly, it's gotten more my books have gotten more backlash for the witchcraft in them. Like, I didn't realize that was still a thing that we were like not allowing in some schools, but so I've gotten criticisms because there's the word witch, but not really. If anyone is criticizing the queer elements, they're outside of my circle and outside of like my awareness.
Actually had I was at a conference, a bilingual educators conference, and I was doing a book talk, and I had I did my book talk to the first 5 people at my table, and somebody who was the head of bilingual education for their entire district said, "I'm sorry, this sounds like a lovely book, but just the word gender fluid would not allow me to bring it to my school board. They would just reject it." And I turned to ask the rest of the teachers at the table if this was true for them too, and they said, "Yeah, we probably couldn't teach it." And so, another crop of teachers came and sat down, and it was like this. And I asked them all the same question: would you be able to teach this book because of the gender fluid character? And they said no. It wasn't so much about the menstruation; it was about the gender fluid character. And that's when I realized that my book was being censored by gatekeepers, quietly censored. And I think that that's really kind of critical of a distinction to make, because there's the kind of obvious censorship, but then there's the people who hold the key, who stand between you and your reader, that we have to kind of work on, unfortunately, and so, and I've had many folks who are Catholic really come down on the character as well, and send me terrible emails. But again, I wrote this character and situated in a spiritual context, so as to teach the community that there's another way. And so I kind of try and keep to that, the integrity behind that.
All right, should I go to the next? All right, so a question from the audience. For all the panelists, how would you describe coming out for a character? Do you build from personal experience, include a different point of view, include barriers from real life? Not focus on that step.
I guess that I want to question the notion that coming out is a step, as if it's a thing that happens once.
Thank you.
We come out to different people at different times about different things in different ways. We might come out to the same person repeatedly as we find new things out about our identity. So I guess what I will say is that my aim is always to be on the optimistic side of realistic. When someone comes out to a character, when a character comes out to another character in my books, it's not always going to be roses, because that's not real life, and that's not helpful to read. But it's also not always going to be everyone who you expect is going to trash them is always going to trash them, because that's not very hopeful, and that's not what I want my readers doing. So what I'm doing is I'm showing different ways that people can respond to give some clues about how to do these things. So I guess it's in that way, David, it's a bit like I'm thinking about my readers and how my readers might come out more than I'm thinking about how I came out.
Yeah, I feel like for so long, queer stories were made from a straight perspective in a way where even when it is sympathetic to the queer character, it still is kind of like interested, or like interested in like how dramatic and how painful that process can be. Is kind of interested in this queer pain in a way that is not personal. It is like voyeuristic. And so I think it's, as queer authors, like as a queer author, I feel like I try to just think about the characters primarily and think about it being from their perspective and not being from the perspective of an observer. So what does it feel like for them? And what does it mean? What are the things that they need people to know about them, and who do they need to know about it? And that's kind of, rather than, I don't think I've ever written like a classic coming out scene, but just sort of, yeah, like you come out in many different ways, and making sure to just really orient it on the characters and not have it be as much about the reaction of other people, for me is really important.
I will have to add, one of my favorite things that I've heard on a queer lit panel this year was from George Johnson, the author of All Boys Aren't Blue, who said that they want us to stop using the term coming out and start using the term inviting in, because the idea that you're not locked somewhere and have to show yourself, you're actually trusting somebody else enough to let them know something about you. And it changed my paradigm so beautifully that any time that I can mention on a panel like this one, I will, because it is a great way of thinking about it. All right, another question, this is great because I genuinely don't know the answer to this for any of you, which is just like, how often do I get to ask questions of you this? So another question that was sent in ahead of time is, did you always know you would be a writer? And if not, what did you think you would do as an adult?
I think I would have been a hat maker, in that, like, when I was a kid, one of my biggest hobbies was like sketching and drawing and coloring hats. So somehow I would have found my way in that direction, I think.
Only hats?
Yeah,
Nothing else?
I was obsessed with, if you can picture, specifically, there was one hat that Audrey Hepburn wears in My Fair Lady. It's like so abstract. And and I would just like draw it again and again, and would draw variations of that. And so anyway, somehow I feel like if writing is in some way still just like a stand-in for hat making, I think.
Fascinating.
I believe in you. I think you can get there eventually. I wanted to be a paleontologist for a while, but I think writing was kind of always very big for me, because reading was very big for me. And I think like graphic novels were kind of a surprise when I realized that I actually could like take drawing, which was something that I liked, and sort of that was a way to make my stories almost like more compelling to me. And it fit in a way that really made sense. And so that's been kind of like the fun surprise, has been that I'm not a prose writer. I'm a graphic novelist.
I kind of have the opposite story of Molly, where I actually started out wanting to be a graphic novelist. And if I wasn't a writer, I was thinking I would be focusing on my art. But for whatever reason in college, I told myself the worst lie possible and was like, I have to choose between writing and art to focus on my craft. And I think that's one of my biggest mistakes this day. So I've actually started to go back to art and try to, maybe 10 years down the line, I'll create a graphic novel for the first time. But
Yeah.
Awesome.
You have a very like visual style. I could see. Yeah. I could picture it really beautifully.
Thank you.
I've always wanted to be a writer, but a different kind of writer. I grew up very poor, and I wanted to help my family get out of the barrio. And when I was 14, 15 years old, and so I went to college, and I wanted to get into advertising, because I figured, I'm going to date myself, but I figured, the person who wrote Coke Is It, man, they got mega money, like I just felt like if I could just write a catchphrase like that, and in advertising, then we're out, and it's on the way up. But of course, when I got to college, I discovered so much about colonization and oppression, and I went, whoa, with capitalism, and I went, whoa. So in the meantime, I was continuing to write, so it was poetry all the way since then.
I also always knew I was a writer, but I didn't realize it would be the thing that I could like get paid for and be my job. And so I was going into education, and I was working as an adult for a while before I got a contract. And my favorite thing to do was I was an LSAT tutor, which is this test to get into law school. I've never been to law school. I do not want to law, but it is the test taker's test, because it's all about an internal logic that is absolutely inane but flawless. And that is my area of expertise. Like within this box, it all works. And I really loved showing other people how to not be fun at parties.
I have to say, for some of the others, I wish they had done what they had said they would do, as well as writing. Alex, I'm glad that you didn't pursue that any further, and I'm glad that you pivoted to writing.
Well, I have to say that you are assuming within that it affects my writing, that I am no longer doing the LSAT in a
Oh, that's
negative
true.
way.
That's true. So if any of you are aspiring lawyers out there, please just mention in the chat and we'll look you up for that.
I'm writing like the YA LSAT book, but there's no market.
It's the untapped genre. I mean, and this is Read with Pride, so it has to be the queer YA LSAT book.
Yes.
It's awesome. All right, so we are almost out of time. Luckily, somebody else sent in the question that I always like to end with. So how convenient for all of us, which is just basically, what books, other than the ones here, would you recommend for people who wanted to read about a kidlit or a teen queer experience? What are some of your favorites to recommend?
Off the top of my head, 2 graphic novels that I adore are The Prince and the Dressmaker by Jen Wang and Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me by Mariko Tamaki and Rosemary Valero O'Connor. They're both so beautifully drawn and just these like really, they're just like gems of stories. Like, I think we were talking earlier about stories as like queer safe space. And I feel that really strongly with comics, where I feel like you really can just dive into a comic and spend as much time in it as you need to. And those are 2 books that I think like anyone who kind of wants to like feel like they're entering this like beautiful like queer world would really love those books.
You already mentioned it, David, but I just finished All Boys Aren't Blue this morning, actually, and I was blown away by it, and I was blown away for many reasons, but the fact that, you know, at the end we get to George Johnson is saying like, I didn't even really know that like a YA memoir existed and that I could write it at 33 years old. It felt like this kind of like this amazing sort of like, I just like saw so much potential in like how much YA can do in terms of form and how, in terms of like what there is still so much more that like, and so many more writers who can like tap into different kinds of storytelling and different kinds of ways of telling their own story. So I just thought that was like, that book is kind of, I'm still like sort of in it days from it. I also just ordered Alex Sanchez and Julie Moreau's graphic novel, which is being delivered. I haven't read it yet, but I'm super excited about it. You Brought Me to Ocean. And I also just pre-ordered too from Archie, Rebecca Barra's forthcoming book, Interview with the Vixen, which I'm thrilled about as well. So yeah, a lot of good stuff, a lot of good new stuff and stuff coming.
I'm super excited by how much queer middle grade is growing. I feel like The Best at It by Malik Punchali was really, it showed like a really joyful experience of a queer boy of color coming into terms with his identity. I really, really loved it. There are more of middle grade queer books of color. I think two of my favorite, I mean, Ashley Herring Blake is just amazing. I really loved Ivy Aberdeen's Letter to the World and The Mighty Heart of Sunny St. James. Those continue to be like 2 of my favorite all-time like queer middle grade books. And I think that there's even more coming. So I'm super excited about that.
I am really excited about, I just ordered Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. Is it good? I don't know.
So
I'm just so excited to read it. And then also one of my favorite authors is Benjamin Alida Sainz, Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. And then one book that's it's not fiction, it's nonfiction, which kind of, allowed me to see myself and my queer identity for the first time, was Chicana Lesbians, the girls your mother warned us about, warned you about. And so that was edited by Cherie Moraga. So
I love that we've gone from a place where I don't know what to recommend because there's so little out there, to I don't know what to recommend because I've read all these things and I can't think which one to say, which is fantastic. I love the Not Your Sidekick series from CB Lee because it's light and it's it's heartful, but it's also, I mean, it's adventure, but it's also queer. And probably one of the great YA writers who doesn't get nearly as much acknowledgement as she deserves is Meredith Russo. Birthday is completely amazing, and it is both about being trans, but not about being trans. It is fully an integrated love story in which the transness is integrally to the story, but also it's beautiful.
Awesome. All right. Well, I encourage everybody to purchase all of these books as well as the books by these authors. Again, Writer's Block Bookstore has all of their books. And again, to show your appreciation for the panel tonight, it'd be great to order the books from Writer's Block. It has been so wonderful. The Read with Pride Book Festival continues. Next Thursday, same time, the Center for Fiction, I believe, is hosting. If you go to the I Read YA page on the social media of your choice, you will find the link and the authors that will be there. Again, for me, recommending literally every one of the authors who's doing Read with Pride this year, I can fully recommend their books. I mean, it's just an abundance of riches. And again, to Alex's point, it used to be that if we wanted to do a Read with Pride event, we would just get the 4 people we had and we do one panel. The fact that we've had to do 4 separate panels, and that isn't even the tip of the iceberg. There are still so many more amazing queer creators, both on the Scholastic list, but also in YA and Kidlit. It's an amazing time to be a part of the community, and it's amazing to see all of these voices telling the stories that people need to hear. So again, thank you to Molly, to Alex, to Kacen, to Will, and to Aida for being with us tonight. Thank you to all of the audience for being here. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize, but you can reach us on our various social media. And again, thanks to Writer's Block for having us and for being such a great independent bookstore. Hopefully I will see a bunch of you next Thursday. Have a good week till then. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.